All right, hi, and welcome back to week 2 of History of Christianity in America and the Restoration Movement. This week we're covering the Awakening, so largely the 18th century, mostly the 1700s in the United States of America, the century where it does become a country in the New World. And this week we're going to focus primarily on a lot of the new denominations that begin to form, how they interacted with one another, and how the denominations play into the awakening and revivals that take place across the nation. And really the first common experience, the common American experience of revivals that take place in this century. So that's mostly what we're going to be covering, starting off with some of the denominations and how that impacts the psyche in America. So first of all, the Quakers. So they're founded originally by George Fox in 1650. Um, Now they're called Quakers in a pejorative sense. It's actually in a negative way. They're called the Quakers, and they kind of take that name on for themselves in a positive light. But that's coming from the fact they travel before the Lord, and they were one of the more unique groups. Meaning that some of their practices were noticeably different, at least in the beginning, from other Protestant denominations. And that largely is coming from the fact that they're not practicing baptism. Even to this day, most of them don't practice baptism, the Lord's Supper, or any ordained ministry. So they kind of have this emphasis, and this is going to be a huge theme throughout this video, and I'll highlight it every time it comes up, this idea of individualism, of each person must have Christ in themselves. Each person must have their own personal sort of relationship with God. And so he's stressing, and early Quakers are stressing, the light of Christ in everyone. And so each individual has the light of Christ. It did stress some good things, especially for uniquely in this time frame, the equality between men and women. That was a huge emphasis for the Quakers, and a lot of the heroes that come out of the Quakers from the beginning were women, and we're going to look at one of them here in just a moment. But the big thing to notice here, because of England's huge presence, the Puritans who were there, you remember they're trying to purify and finish the Reformation in England. The ones who are president in the United States, they're viewing them as heretics, and they're viewing them as sort of a threat to society at large. And so they take some strong action against the against the Quakers. Just one chief example, and I highlight this for a number of reasons. We'll cover it, and then we'll talk about why this is so important to realize. So this is a picture of Mary Dyer. She's the third, actually, to be martyred by the Puritans in just a short period in Boston. This was pretty common for people to have sort of religious differences and then be kicked out of a community. Again, this is taking place in the United States. Pretty early on. She dies in 1660, but this is taking place in the United States. She's kicked out of Boston by the Puritans. She goes back anyway, and they hang her for her faith. And so I highlight this to show you that not all Protestants were getting along in the New World. And Puritans were often taking strong measures. And notice the year here. It's important to see exactly the year. My highlighter here. So she's dying in 1660. So this is really early on. And I highlight this year because later on, when I point out some interdenominational action, some cooperation that goes on, it's going to be much later. But we're going to see this transition from much more strict divisions to much more united and much more open to unity. But at this point in history, especially amongst the Puritans and how they view the Quakers, it's quite strict in how they interact with other denominations. Okay, now the toleration continues to grow. So in 1688, so 28 years after someone is hanged for their faith in the United States, And this is going on in England, and this is going on in a much larger extent. People are being persecuted if they're not a part of the official church. And English Parliament decides to pass the Toleration Act of 1688. Keep in mind, this is fairly young still. This is about 100 years before the United States are officially founded. And I highlight this here. It's not just this one act that I'm wanting us to notice, but what I'm wanting us to notice is that toleration is beginning to grow and become lax. What it allows is for Protestants to become less persecuted legally. You had to hold to a Trinity, you had to be Protestant, you had to do those sort of practices, but you were not officially part of England and you were okay. So you could be a deserter. That's one of the titles that you might see passed around in the books about this. But you could still live there peacefully. This protected many Quakers, and so in the United States, some people will appeal to this. Even Presbyterians will appeal to this and say, hey, we're not as different from you as the Quakers are, and you let the Quakers be fine, so you ought to let the Presbyterians be fine. And it's a pretty valid point. But again, this is the shift that's gradually starting. So it allowed them to practice their faith. They were still fined, interestingly enough, but they were allowed to meet and to get together, officially speaking. So as time went on, this original passing of the Act of Toleration, or the Toleration Act, they're called both things, as time went on, it became more and more lax. So at first you had to believe in the Trinity for this to apply to you. Eventually you don't even have to believe in the Trinity. And as centuries continued and continued, this shift became even more strong, where you could be more and more different theologically speaking and still be protected by this act. And so this is a significant moment, but it's a gradual shift that takes place. And I want you to be aware that the shift is gradual, even though there's definitive moments. Okay, so because of this, there are some official records of court cases of people appealing to this act of toleration in the United States. Quakers were stopped being hung for their faith in many places because of this. So that's what's going on in England. And in the New World, the toleration is still varying greatly. I mean, just because it passed over there doesn't mean that overnight everyone's mindset towards various Protestant groups shifts, but it is changing at this point in time. Okay, so one of the groups that is tolerated at first and kind of gains respect and will have a significant presence, and eventually the Restoration movement will actually come out of Presbyterian ministers primarily, at least Thomas and Alexander Campbell, and they will start a whole history of our church. But the Presbyterians in America, so they're first starting in 1684. So this is after the Act of Toleration by Francis McKimmey. So they join together and they have their first official synod in Philadelphia, where regardless of what country you're from, the different Presbyterians were coming together at least yearly, and were sort of deciding and debating a few things, but they were beginning to work together amongst the Presbyterians. So he helped a lot of the Presbyterians start working together in the United States. And so that's, at least from a historical perspective, that's one of their first significant moments in the United States, early 18th century. He was eventually arrested in New York for preaching without a license. Again, in New York, there's already diversity, but you can still be arrested for preaching without a license. There's still strict rules that you have to follow. This is one of the few states where Catholics and Protestants were living together, and you could still be arrested for it. However, his trial actually ended up helping his cause and the whole Presbyterian cause, because what he did when he went before, in the trial, what he did was he said, you know what? In the Act of Toleration, the Quakers are allowed to be here. The Quakers are tolerated, but the Presbyterians hold to the Trinity. The Presbyterians practice baptism. We practice the Lord's Supper. so you ought to be allowing us. And that kind of popularized the Presbyterian views among other Protestants, and it gained a sense of authority and respect for the Presbyterians in the United States. And that sort of respect, kind of stemming all from this, spread pretty rapidly. And so Presbyterians had a good name even among some Puritans at this time. The other thing they did that was really setting the stage for what takes place in the centuries that follow is they held large communion events to set the stage for camp meetings. So they got together a few times a year. They had these large sermons and week-long, almost like revivals, where they were kind of getting their hearts ready for communion, and they were getting people ready for communion. And that sort of mentality of let's hold something together for a significant religious experience, that's taking place before revivals are taking place pretty much anywhere in the world, but especially in the United States. And so this is setting the stage. It's getting people okay with the idea of multiple sermons really quickly and some sort of religious experience as a result. So you kind of see the seeds being planted of revivals with the Presbyterians. Okay, the other thing that we need to be aware of is the Pietist movement. So they're starting in Europe, big picture. They're starting in Europe. They make their way to the United States. And it's a movement, less of a denomination, because this impacts multiple different denominations across the Protestant group, and even amongst some Catholics this is taking place. So they are originating with the German Lutheran Philip Spinner. At least he's the one who wrote some of the first literature on this Pietist spirit, as he calls it. And it spreads quite rapidly. Now, it does come to America, the most significant person, and Noel talks about him in other books, but not so much in our textbook. But in America, kind of the most prevalent pietist who kind of comes and gets the ideas popularized is Nicholas Ludwig von Zinzendorf. I've got a picture of him coming up soon. What a cool name to have. But he's sort of the one who spreads it in the United States, especially at first. But it spans far beyond him. And piety and the pursuit of piety is something that's well respected amongst many Protestants very quickly in the United States. But some defining features, and some of these features will sound like, yeah, that's the way that things are, and that's the way that everyone thinks that way. Well, a lot of these are kind of new emphases that are taking place in the United States and in Europe. This idea of individualism, again, that's huge. That's the shift that's taking place from being corporal to individual. It's this aspect of spirituality that expanded beyond confessions. Now, here's what this means, and I want to be as clear as we possibly can on this. Previously, what had separated denominations was, well, we have the Westminster Confession, we have these creeds, we have this belief, and the distinguishing features of the faith were what you believed. So creed meaning belief. It was deciding, okay, what am I going to believe, and that's what church I'm going to be a part of. What begins to take place more and more with the Pietist movement is this sense of experience and individualism, that I have encountered God. And it's no longer just what I believe. Not that it ever was just about what you believe, but the emphasis is now more on what are you experiencing as an individual, where are you connecting with God. This is a shift that, immediately we can see the implications of this for the church now. And a lot of that stems from the seed that's planted early on with the Pietist movement. Another kind of important note about the Pietist movement, and we haven't talked a lot about this yet, is that it grew as a parallel to the increasingly deistic nominalism from the Enlightenment. That's a mouthful. What does that mean? It means, so in the Enlightenment, which we looked at in our last video, there's this sense of some people are approaching their faith more nominally, less less devoted, less allegiant to living out their faith, less interested in a God who's intertwined with the universe and working all things together for the good, and he's more detached. And so there's this deistic kind of approach that's growing with enlightenment, where people are viewing God as less and less central to society. And as a result of that, you've got a lot of people who are no longer deeply involved in church and no longer attending on Sundays. But at the same time, you've got this movement of piety going on. And so it's kind of making up for, in a lot of ways, it's preaching to, it's connecting best with those who kind of view God before as this detached being. Well, if you have an experience with him, he's not that detached. So you're kind of hungry and thirsty for this experience of God, and along comes this pietist movement, and it's, this encountering God through the growth of forming Christ in us and encountering our real spiritual life. And so it appealed to many people who were previously nominal in their faith. And that still happens today. You have people who don't view God as that intertwined with their life. They have some sort of experience, and then they start being able to see him everywhere. It's sort of the same thing that's taking place in the early part of the United States. So this pietist movement, one of the main ways it gets to the United States is it's among the Dutch Reformed and a lot of the other Reformed. I mean, it starts with the Lutherans, but a lot of the Reformed come over, and especially Calvinists, and have this idea of encountering God in some capacity. And so all of this is setting the stage even more and more, and we'll see how this connects with the Methodists and what takes place with the rest of the world. But the pietist movement, by and large, it's an individualistic movement that is beginning to shape the way that Americans think about the faith. Okay, so here's the guy I mentioned before. He's sort of one of the main bringers of pietism to the United States. Nicholas Ludwig von Zinzendorf. So he's a Moravian bishop. So Moravians go back, one of the earliest Protestant groups, and he visited the New World for only a few years. And I highlight him. He's, at least some of what he did, I think is one of the reasons why he's one of my heroes for this time period. Because he's, before other people are really doing it, he's promoting interdenominational meetings, meaning he's wanting Lutherans, Presbyterians, and others to work together. Again, we're only talking about Protestants here, but he's wanting them to work together. So he establishes at least one, and several others he helped with, Moravian communities, but then he served as a Lutheran pastor. So, he's all over the place. In a lot of ways, even though this is taking place 60, 70 years before the Restoration movement really gets moving, the mentality of working together with other Protestants, what we will find so crucial in next week's video about working together with other Protestant denominations, this concept had been floating around in major figures before, especially among those who were chiefly concerned about spiritual growth. If you are a pietist and you don't care as much about my devotion to the Lutheran Church or my devotion to the Moravians or whatever it is, what I care about is how people interact with God. And if that's your approach to it, well then of course the natural conclusion, at least this is for him thinking, his natural conclusion is, okay, of course we should work together and do things together. And so anytime you approach the faith as if your goal is going to be bringing people with an encounter with Christ, well then your natural conclusion is always going to be working together with other Christians. And we'll see a whole lot about that next week. But I'm kind of planting that seed in there because Alexander Campbell, Barton Stone, they're not the first figures to promote Christian unity in the United States. This was happening before America was founded. And he had a cool name. If you have a name like that, then I would put that on a slide for you as well. All right. So this is big picture now. I'm just taking a step back. What has happened and how this sets the stage for the beginning of the country, the revivals, and kind of the most crucial moments in American history. So we're ripe for harvest. America at this point, again, we're talking about what becomes the United States of America. In the early 18th century was both increasingly deistic, so people are less devoted and less of a view kind of this personal interacting God, and they're open also more, it's increasingly so, to interdenominational meetings. So that's in the soil of America at this point, if you want to think of it that way. And people have become less allegiant to their church leaders in Europe. So you've got people who are having experiences with God, and you have less devotion to foreign countries and the churches that they are a part of. Add that in, that the growth that takes place in the United States at this point, going from 240,000, so at the beginning of the 17th century, to 1.1 million by 1750. And even more so by 1787, you have about 4 million people in the United States of America. So at this point, it's a rapid expansion. People are encountering God and are becoming less devoted. And this is in the soil for the revivals that begin to take place. How is it possible to have a revival? Well, you have people who are less devoted to their home church, meaning their home country church. You have people who are okay working with other Christians. And now you have a sense of individualism, that what's most important is how you encounter Christ. So this is preparing us for what takes place in the United States of America. Okay, and kind of the first group that takes advantage of this, some of the best preachers ever, and I really mean this, some of the best missionaries, some of the best preachers from the pulpit come out of the Methodists. A lot of heroes come out of the Methodists for this reason. So they start by John Wesley and his brother Charles. So these are both men living in Oxford at the time. They're both Anglicans, so they're part of the Church of England, and both very, very religious, both trying to take their faith very serious, but both kind of are, at least at the early stages before they become Methodists, before they're called Methodists, they are dissatisfied with how faithful they are. And that's clear from their journals. While they're at Oxford, so John Wesley's a fellow at Oxford, he's teaching at the Lincoln College there, and they start a holy club. And this holy club almost mirrors a monastic movement in that they have certain fasting rules, they have a rule to live their life by, and it was very, and this is a key word, methodological. They were approaching their faith in some sort of method that, I fast this way, I live this way, I pray in this way. And so someone in a pejorative way, this is so typical, calls them the Methodists because they had a method to their faith. And, John Wesley and his brother are okay with being called that, so they ended up being okay with the term Methodist. But they're chiefly concerned with holiness. When you hear that someone has rules that they live by for their faith, there's kind of a negative way to view that, like, oh, they're being legalistic, or they're approaching their faith like the Pharisees and Sadducees, and that's not what Christ wants. But then there's the positive way of approaching that, and I really think this is the more accurate way of viewing it, how especially the Wesleys approach their faith, where they have these rules because they're trying to become holy. They're trying to become like Christ, and they don't think that these rules save them. I'll read for us here in a moment part of John Wesley's journal. And in his journal, he talks all the time about how these rules are really nothing in comparison to encountering Christ. And so he's after this sort of pietist encounter with Christ, and he's not just after following rules thinking that those will save him. But when someone has a rule to live their life by, that doesn't mean that they're trying to be legalistic. It might simply mean they're trying to encounter Jesus, which I think is a noble cause. Okay, so they travel in early on in their life, they travel to the New World and kind of as missionaries to the natives and preach to others as well there. And again, at this point, they're Anglicans. But they're largely unsuccessful. I mean, they have very few converts. And they go back and they are just disheartened. I mean, John Wesley, in his journal, and I've read through this part of his journal where he talks about how it must be reflective of his lack of faith that people just weren't being converted. Never mind that some of the prophets had no converts in the scriptures, but he largely thought he was unsuccessful because of a failure on his part, because of the faith. There's a real sense of you can only give what you have in his mindset. And then this conversion happens, this awakening, softening of the heart. This takes place May 24th, and we know the exact date and where it happened and what was happening on 1738. So this is kind of a key date for revivals, because soon after, Wesley is going to go to the United States and preach as a result of the warming of his heart that takes place. So this happens at a Moravian meeting. So in England, kind of going to another denomination's meeting, they're simply reading the preface to Martin Luther's Romans commentary and about all the saving faith has. I mean, it's not a very long preface. I've read it before a few times, but I want to read for you. This is from his journal. I want to read for you a part of what he says in this day. So this is May 24th of 1738. So when I made my way back to England in January of 1738, being in immediate danger of death and very uneasy on that account, I was strongly convinced that the cause of my uneasiness was unbelief, and that gaining his true living faith was the one thing needful for me. But still I fixed not this faith on its right object. I meant only faith in God, not faith in or through Christ. Okay. In the evening I went very unwillingly to a society in the Aldrich Street, where one was reading Luther's preface to the Epistle to the Romans. About 9:15, while he was describing the change which God works in the heart through faith in Christ, I felt my heart strangely warmed. I felt I did trust in Christ, Christ alone for salvation, and assurance, key word there, that assurance, an assurance was given me, and he had taken away my sins, even mine, and saved me from the law of sin and death. Okay, there's a whole lot there I wish I could read. And you can pick up and find online that whole journal. It's easily available online. Just search that date of his journal entry. But why I read that section is some of those phrases of what's going on with people in England who are being influenced, and especially John Wesley and the Methodists, and this becomes one of the defining factors of the Methodists, is this warming of heart, and with that, this assurance. And we'll see a whole lot about that here in just a moment. So this is just a picture of John, and that's Charles. Wesley, some of the most influential men in the early ages of American Christianity and the Methodist movement. Okay. So awakening and revival in the New World. So you have people who are having these personal experiences, warming of their heart, and they're no longer relying on the fact, and hear this part, they're no longer relying on the fact that they're a part of the English church, or they're a part of this church, or the Lutheran church, but they're beginning to rely more on their encounter with Christ. Now, they had those before, and ultimately they would say that's what they were relying on previously, but now the stress and the focal point is becoming less about I'm a part of this church and more about I'm a part of the Christian church. I'm a part of my experience with God. As a result of that, there's this identity shift, massive identity shift that takes place in the United States. And this revival, this awakening and revivals that begin happening in the 1730s and 1740s, this is really the first uniting experience for American Protestants. I mean, this is the first thing that really is a national experience, are these revivals that take place by the Methodists and by a few others. We'll look at those. But this is the uniting factor. If you're looking for an identity, this is where a lot of it's coming from. People experiencing revival together. Mostly done in fields and in large open areas. Why is that? Well, and that's a crucial point, because it's not happening inside of the church buildings that are affiliated with England or affiliated, with Presbyterians. They're happening in fields because that's where everybody was allowed to go. And again, this is sort of becoming an American experience. They're doing this together. They're not doing this as a part of the Church of England. No, they're doing this as members of this new world and members as Christians. And so this is the identity shift that really changes at this point. It goes from I'm a part of this church to we're all a part of the church. And that happens to varying degrees, but that's the shift that's taking place at this point in history. One of the bonuses, and one of the things I love about early awakening especially, is that it was reaching marginalized groups. I mean, blacks were being converted and being preached to, and were hearing the gospel. And in many places were starting their own churches. Now there are some racist things that were taking place at this point, but they were kind of being viewed as humans and being viewed as respectful people in the image of God in many places. And so I wanted to highlight that because especially during the Civil War, when we look at kind of a history, a little bit of how denominations interacted with racism, that becomes kind of something to look back on. That the Methodists especially were very kind to minority groups, and many of them should be praised for that. But also the women and the poor, people who were oppressed, they were sort of the ones who were being reached especially. And it makes sense. If you have a high position in the church and therefore you have a high position in society, you're less inclined to go out to a field and listen to a guy preach. But if you're marginalized, you're more likely to go out and hear about how everyone can be united. And those are just general rules. It's not always the case at all, but that's part of what's going on here. Things that it stressed. Now this is where we kind of are so intertwined with our own culture that it becomes difficult to see it any other way. But this is where this is coming from, and it's a great opportunity for us to reflect on kind of what assurance and holiness and salvation mean for the church today. So the awakenings, they really stress conversion. So this word of assurance gets played a lot, but they're really trying to convert people. And assurance, people are looking to make sure that they are one of the elect. So different words get used for assurance frequently. One of the more common ones was evidence of your effectual calling. I mean, if you are, and there's so many Calvinists at this point, but not just Calvinists, if you are trying to look for evidence that God wants to save you, and you know He's not going to save everyone. So the assurance that you're looking for, that Wesley found in that encounter with the Moravians, that assurance is going to be a crucial moment in your life. It's going to be what eventually becomes in the second awakening and second great revival, is this idea of evidence of my effectual calling, of crisis conversion, where I have a moment where I can point to and say, that's where Christ entered my heart. Now, did that happen before this? Yeah, I mean, it did, and there's clear examples of that throughout the history of the church. But this became normal for people to sort of look for a moment. And you can see pietism, you can see all of this coming together and making sense out of why people were looking for assurance. It also stressed holiness, and I mean, it wasn't just all about conversion. There was a real sense of holiness was proof that I had an assurance, and so those are intertwined in many ways. And stress salvation. Reaching people has the tendency to stress salvation, but it also it is a shift away from the debates about God in some ways, because it's more about how does God save me? And so the focus can actually, if you are not careful, make an idol out of salvation, where the most important thing is what God has done for me and not who God is. And it's very, very tricky how to phrase that accurately, but that's a shift that's going on, where the focus, in some ways, and this is not true across the board, can become focused more on the individual and the person being saved. Okay, all of that to say, with the thought of Christianity outside of the established church came the idea of a society outside of the established church. So if your faith and politics are intertwined, then the reasonable thing to say is, well, if my faith is no longer intertwined with that state, then my state no longer needs to be a part of that state. It allowed for this opportunity, this individual approach, and this common American experience. It opened up the door for people to be able to say, you know what, we don't need those people over there. We can have our own religious experience. We don't need the government over there telling us what to do. And saying it in those terms might sound very clear. It's a very complex issue, but for a lot of people, this opens the idea to, do I really need them for the state if I don't need them for the church? That's the shift. And that's what begins to happen because of the awakening and revivals. All right. Okay. George Whitefield. You'll also hear it pronounced George Whitfield. I've heard scholars pronounce it both ways. I don't care which way we pronounce it. I'm probably just going to say Whitefield, just because Whitfield, I don't know, it doesn't flow off the tongue right. He's the most well-known preacher in the 18th century. I mean, just hands down, that guy. And no, this is not just something trying to make him look bad. He was cross-eyed and had a lot of deformities in different ways. He's the most well-known minister for Protestants in this time frame. He was actually a student under John Wesley. I say he worked alongside him. That's true. He was a part of the Holy Club while they were at Oxford together. And so he is coming from an Anglican group and eventually working with the Methodists and being kind of a Methodist himself in some respects. It's tricky which group he was a part of, because he was kind of a part of all of them and kind of creating this American experience. But if you are thinking about the revivals and you are thinking about George Whitefield, one thing I want you to hear so clearly from me is that he was a preacher, not just on Sunday, but he carried around with him a pulpit that he could put in the middle of a field, stand up on. And in fact, Benjamin Franklin went to hear him preach once. And Benjamin Franklin, being the scientific mind that he was, not that he agreed with George Whitefield on what he was saying, but he respected him. And he kind of walked a certain distance away from George Whitefield and could hear him further and further away because he's kind of up and preaching in the open air. And Benjamin Franklin concluded about 30,000 people could listen to him at once. Before microphones, I mean, must have had a powerful voice if he was speaking like that. Theologically, he's this strict Calvinist. And that actually causes problems and even a split at one moment with John Wesley. They eventually reconcile and are kind to each other again, but they even pray together and they have revivals together. But there's some disunity because John Wesley and a lot of the Methodists were not Calvinists. So and they're not simply Arminian. I mean, people were teaching free will before Jacob S. Arminius came around, but he's not just a follower of sort of the hard reform dogma of Calvinism that became known as Calvinism. So there was debates in the United States before this, but this was an example of people who disagreed working together. Again, that takes place for the Restoration movement as well. What I'm wanting us to see, though, is that they were working together and they had this unity, but it was still creating a common experience for Calvinists and non-Calvinists alike. Okay, just a couple of quick facts about him. Also, he's preaching without notes. I mean, he gets up there for a long time, in hours in some instances, preaches to crowds, loud preaching sermons, and he's not using notes while he's doing this. I mean, I would have loved to listen to him. But as a result of that, we just frankly don't have all of his 15,000 sermons because he didn't write them out in the same way that other ministers did. And he died while he was on a preaching tour, as he hoped he would do. And maybe one day that'll happen for me as well. All right. So this is just a map of, I want you to see the vastness of the land he covers. When we say he's creating a common American experience, what I really mean is he is going and preaching probably some of the same sermons, especially if you're preaching without notes. And he's going by horseback, and he's going along the sea, or especially in the years 39 and 41, he's encountering a great many people and creating this common experience. And again, at this point in American history, by 1750, there's a little over 1 million people in the United States, at least right here, and in these colonies. And he's preaching to as many as 8,000. We know for sure he preached to 8,000 people at one sermon. So, if you're preaching for a couple years and you're preaching to thousands each time, you're going to become pretty well known. And in an era before the internet, this was one of the uniting factors in the American experience was hearing these men speak about encountering Christ. And so why their theology becomes so important is it wasn't just sort of their individual thinking, but in their sermons, if this is the common religious experience in America, the way that they preached is going to end up having a great impact on the way the whole country thinks about God and politics. So I wanted us to see just how vast it was. Okay. Another major figure at this time is Jonathan Edwards. He did preach, but really what you should think of him more as is this theological writer. I know Noel calls him the apologist, and it's not that that's inaccurate, but what he really means is that he's sort of providing theological backing for both defending revivals, which he wrote several things on, but also for just providing doctrine that kind of is the blood of many of these groups that begin to form and stress. So things he emphasized, he stressed human sin and the goodness of God. So this idea that everyone is truly guilty and in need of a savior, that's an emphasis in his work. But with that is the goodness of God. And these aren't just this isn't just the bad and the good. They're intertwined. What I mean is, from a theological standpoint, it is best to know that God is greater than we think he is, and we are worse than we think we are. And the more you make those connections, the more you realize that one of them's true, it's necessary that you follow the other one's true. Because as you get closer to God, as you get closer to the goodness of God, you realize more and more how far away you've always been. So you see how those two are connected. Okay. He preached a sermon. I've read the sermon a few times. It's short. You can find it quite easily. It's not a real page turner. But it had an impact. As people are growing lax, and he preaches this sermon how God is like holding us, and there's just this small spider string, that's holding us, and he could just drop us off into the fire, and that would be it. But because he loves us, he's not doing that. And that kind of drove people to repentance. Now he's reading the sermon with big old glasses and note cards right in front of his face. He's not a very energetic preacher, but you don't always have to be energetic and exciting to get really good points across and to help move in the hearts of people. And this is an example of God working in someone who, from all that I have seen, was not a powerful speaker from kind of a worldly perspective, but he was being moved and worked by God in many ways. So he argued for Calvinism. So he's one of the proponents of Calvinism and this experiential knowledge of God's grace. And so again, he's this emphasis of individualism and encountering God, looking for assurance. That's what's being created in this soil of America at this time. Okay, so the results of the Great Awakening. We've looked at some of the preachers from it. We've looked at kind of where they went and the emphasis of it. But this is what happened as a result of the 30s and 40s, of 1730s and 40s. There became a common experience outside of the authority of Europe. What happens when you get large amounts of people with lots of motivation having a common experience together? Well, sometimes you form a country, and that's precisely what takes place. Really, were it not for the great revivals, you would still have a lot of groups who were so adamantly against each other, and the revivals helped people get along better. So the idea of independence began to expand politically and religiously. So, denominations are growing more and more. Some of them are growing more and more unsatisfied with the fact that they have to report back to a country that isn't in their back door anymore. And personal experience and conversion became critical components of the faith. When you see someone getting baptized today, or whenever you're baptizing somebody, or when I'm baptizing somebody, you might hear the expression, "Do you accept Christ as your personal Lord and Savior?" Well, it's not that that's a bad question, and it's not that that's evil in any sense of the word, but the emphasis that we put in mostly Protestant American churches is on a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. This is coming from the Pietists, the First Great Awakening, and this revivals that are taking place, where we are wanting people to acknowledge a personal relationship, personal experience with Christ, what we would call an assurance of faith. And so that becomes crucial part of what we think is part of the American experience from a religious standpoint. Okay, I want to go into kind of a question to get us thinking about all of this. We've looked at the diversity, we've looked at Protestants and all the interactions that they're having with one another. What I want to turn to now is a question that you'll probably be asked or you have to interact with, and it's this question of America's founding and Christianity. Was America founded on Christian principles? Maybe the most debated Christian thing about America, at least online, is this question. I want us to kind of take a step back and, having looked at some of the evidence right now, I want us to think about the question itself, because this changes the approach that we have and the way that we view politics and faith. So I want to tread carefully, but I do want to push us to really think about what this question means. So when we get asked this, I think what I do when I approach people and they're, every July 4th, when people are having the debates about religion on Sunday morning, this happens every year. You get questions about, okay, well, what part of Christianity, what role did Christianity have in the founding of America? And when I get asked, was America founded on Christian principles, or when I'm told America is founded on Christian principles, what I've found is usually that question is a Trojan horse of some kinds, that you get asked this question because someone wants to say, well, then we can do this, or then we can do this. And really, it's more complicated than that. So this is kind of the second point here. Was America founded on Christian principles? Well, that depends on what you think a Christian principle is. Do you think that that is a devotion to Jesus? Do you think that that is, belief in a God? And kind of how you answer this question dictates how you answer this question. What is a Christian principle? Is it freedom? Is it liberty and pursuit of happiness? Is it the fact that we have a creator? Well, all of those things would be accepted by people of other faiths as well. And so it's a complex thing. It depends where you are, because many of the people in America at the time who were Christians, they had an established state religion, but from a federal level, they're just not going to have an established religion. And so it kind of depends on where you're at in the United States. I wanted to highlight this point too, that God is a word that means different things for different people. When you read the words, we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, what people mean by Creator, from deists to Christians to kind of Christian deists, can vary greatly. And just because someone is saying we have a Creator doesn't necessarily by itself mean that it's a Christian concept. I mean, it is part of our faith to say that we have a Creator, we are created, but that by itself isn't specific enough about what it means to be a Christian. Kind of the approach that I take when I'm discussing these things is, most of the time I'll point people to this book. This is a book called Faiths of the Founding Fathers. This is by David Holmes. This is probably the book that I would recommend if you're really interested in seeing the faiths of the different types of faiths, really well documented, of the Founding Fathers. And that's the person who came up, Holmes is the person who came up with these categories I've created. And he breaks it down into sort of three categories among the founders. There were the deists, those who really weren't affiliated at all with Christianity. Then you had the Christians, those who were faithful Christians, and there were some in the founders. I want to be clear about that. And then you had Christian deists. So you had people who were attending service and maybe believing in God, but their devotion to Christ was very explicitly challenging. And even after their death, George Washington, for example, the minister that he attended the church at, after his death, the minister was asked about his faith, and he said of George Washington that man was a deist. And it's kind of Christian deism, because he attended a Christian church, but he was a deist by the calling of the preacher. And so you have these kind of three categories of people that are existing. So it's a pretty diverse group. I do want to highlight this, though, in favor of saying it was founded on Christian ideas, is that many of the Christians, and this becomes relevant for the Restoration movement, many thought the founding of America was going to signal the reign of Christ. So Alexander Campbell, who you don't need to know about yet, but we will start on him next week, he writes The Millennial Harbinger. So he's thinking that the millennium is coming, that this is the end, and America is sort of this final moment in history for the reign of Christ to come. So you had some people thinking of America in those terms. You had others thinking of it in kind of less religious terms. And you had a mix of people, and it depends on where you're at, who you asked, why America was being founded. But you had a diverse group of people at the beginning of the nation. A few more notes here. I highlight this. This is it's called the Treaty of Tripoli. This was done with the Ottoman Empire, so Muslims, And this was signed a decade after America started, so John Adams is president. And I'll just read this quote for you. It gets unanimous support from not just the Senate, but also from the Congress without debate. So they had all of this in front of them, and they agreed on it. John Adams himself signs it, and it was actually written by the advisor, the old advisor of George Washington, the first president. And so all that to say that this was current in their thinking. And listen to this quote. This is from Article 11 of this document. It says, "The government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion, as it has in itself no character of enmity against the laws, religion, or tranquility of the Muslims." Now they're saying that because they want to do trade and they want protection from these pirates, and so they're having this peace, and they have to revise it in 1805. Or there's a lot of history going on there. But what we find from this is that officially, within a decade, with a lot of the original Senate and a lot of the third president of the United States and a lot of these original founders of our country, they don't feel the need to challenge at all the statement that America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. Now, they are thinking primarily from a federal level. That is to say that most of the states, have an official state religion. Again, Massachusetts, from taxpayers' money, supported ministers up till 1834. So, I mean, they still are supporting their own ministers. But from a federal level, the government of the United States, the united part, is the emphasis there, is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. So from an official standpoint, you have the president, John Adams, saying that we're not founded on the Christian religion. And there is a sense in, well, why did they have to say that? Well, because they are talking with Muslims, and they kind of have to make sure that they're being clear. So they had interest in kind of stretching it a little bit about what they're trying to do. But I think this is reflective of, from a federal level, just how clear the government was trying to be that the states could have their own religion, but from a federal standpoint, we could not. One more thing I want to share with us here. So this is a letter from George Washington. I don't just share this to look at George Washington's faith, but there's a very specific reason I highlight this quote. So this is from a letter that he wrote in 1792. He says that religious controversies are always productive of more acrimony and irreconcilable hatreds than those which spring from any other cause. I had hoped that liberal and enlightened thought would have reconciled the Christians so that their religious fights would not endanger the peace of society. Now, George Washington went to church. He is a believer in a God, definitely. And I can't say I don't know. I can't know his heart towards Christ or towards the faith in general. But from kind of an outside standpoint, it seems like he is more of a focus on enlightened thought and looking for peace. Again, these are Americans who are trying to escape the religious fights. And this summarizes everything we've looked at so far. They're hoping that there can be something better than religious fights. So he's, and it's not even religion per se, but religious controversies that he's critiquing here. So he's not critiquing all religion, or else he wouldn't go to church himself. But this does highlight the emphasis that people have had on religious experience that people are wanting. And this is written just a few years after the founding of the nation. So there you have it. One of the most or the most well-known man of his day, and the president himself, talking about what he had hoped the Enlightenment would do to society. There's a whole lot more that could be said about that, but this summarizes a lot of the mindset that people had towards religion at the time. All right, I want to summarize a lot of what we've looked at so far. So Protestants multiplied and became more diverse and, generally speaking, more tolerant. So Protestants are allowing, outdoor meetings, working together. And some Protestants are promoting interdenominational unity and experience. And since revivalism stressed communal preaching, personal experience, the emphasis became less about being a part of the state church. And that's so crucial to understanding everything we've talked about. And assurance. Next week, we'll take a bigger look at this word, because this becomes a hot topic in the Second Great Awakening. But people were looking for proof that God had saved them. And not just Calvinists, but John Wesley had that experience of assurance. And there's this growing sense of independence. So when America is founded, independence really is the product of people having their own personal experience with God. And so you don't need your state church. Well, maybe you don't need your state. And that's the thinking that begins to creep in the United States, and that's why it became its own country. That's an interpretive history there, but I think that that's fair to say. And with new religious possibilities became the possibility of the new country. So exactly what I just said. So that's all that we've looked at so far. A lot of material there, I know, but if you kind of catch these points and you catch kind of all the big things that have taken place throughout these slides, you'll see kind of the key words that I've wanted us to see. So that's it for this week, and next week we will cover beginning of the Stone Candle movement, the Second Great Awakening, and some of the history that is carried on directly to today is becoming more and more obvious as we move on from here.